Yes.
Good evening. We're glad you're joining us for this Christmas Day candle lighting service, Christmas Eve, I should say. No, the eve of Christmas Day. Now, it's very unusual for Christmas to be on Sunday, so we're going to take the opportunity to end this Christmas Day with a sacred candle lighting service. And so since we are not doing that music in the beginning, shall I
I think
just
we'll start
begin?
with, I think we'll start with a Matthew 5:14.
Ah,
You were the light of the world. Let your light shine before others. It's a beautiful way to begin.
thank you. Yes, that's a quote from the Bible,
Matthew 5:14.
Matthew 5:14. And so this candlelighting service is all about honoring and recognizing the Christ in you, each individual. And Matthew Fox is a very well-known former Catholic priest who does his own ministry now. And this is a quote from him. He says, Christ isn't a term restricted to the individual Jesus of Nazareth, but is a divine consciousness seeking to come alive in all humans. So we believe that all humans have Christ in them, and we call that the Christ consciousness. And it's not something, we always have the presence of it, but the awareness of the presence of it is what we call the Christ consciousness. And so I would like to share with you some writings by Ernest Holmes, our founder. And he says, we are beginning to understand more of the meaning of Christ, this Emmanuel, or God with us, the direct relationship of the universal to the particular, of the infinite to the finite, of God to man, of the heavenly Father to the earthly Son. The forming of this Christ within us is the incarnation of the Almighty, consciously received, and the power attending this new birth is the result of opening a greater channel in our own minds through which the originating cause may flow. And he says, just as Jesus recognized that he was one with the Father, so must we. It is the birth of such an awareness which we should let happen to us this Christmas time. When we reach this point in our thinking, we come to know the great good which works through us. To practice the presence of God is to awaken within us the Christ consciousness. And so this candlelighting service that I created is designed to honor that and to awaken. And we show and we believe this trifold consciousness of Christmas. And I would like to show you a graphic that was created by Dennis Merritt Jones, one of our ministers and retired now, and he is also a wonderful writer, has many books. And he created this graphic to explain how we celebrate Christmas in our metaphysical teaching. He says there are three dimensions of Christmas: the externalization of the light, and that is Christmas as a holiday, holy day, but it is it's the light outside of us. So we put up lights all around, put them on our trees, but it's an externalization of the light. And then there's the celebration of Christ Jesus. The light of the world is born. And so we do that also. We celebrate this time as a time of Jesus's birth. We really don't know exactly when Jesus was born, and it probably wasn't December 25th, but it doesn't matter. It is a day that was chosen to celebrate his birth into the world. So we celebrate it. And the last one is the internalization of the light. the mystical Christ is born in you, in each one of us. And that's what we want. That's what we strive for, is it not? So that's what we're striving for. And that's what we are focusing on in this candlelighting service. So I chose 7 different symbols of the nativity story, because, you know, each one of those represents an important part of the birth story and the birth of the Christ consciousness within us. And so as we do this, the end part will be something that you will repeat and say as I say it.
How do I do the full screen?
You go up to the green little dot up above the 3 dots. Excuse me for pointing.
Okay.
Okay. So, and this is not a literal interpretation. It is a metaphysical interpretation of the symbols of the birth story. And so the first symbol I chose to celebrate is the virgin birth. And the symbol of the virgin birth is that of purity. Before we can give birth to the Christ consciousness, we must be pure of heart. The Christ consciousness enters not into the one who is less than loving. So this season of Christmas, we choose to be love and express love at every opportunity. So if you'll light the first candle. And I invite you to say with me, I express purity in thought, word, and deed, as I invite awareness of the Christ consciousness within me. And the second symbol of the birth is the place where the Bible tells us Jesus was born, which is Bethlehem. Bethlehem in Hebrew means house of bread, meaning house of sustenance. Bread was the major source of food for people in Jesus's day. And so the symbol of the birth in Bethlehem is that we receive our sustenance from the practice of the teachings of love and forgiveness of Christ. And so as we light the second candle, please say with me, I am nourished and sustained by the practice of love and forgiveness as I cultivate the Christ consciousness within me. The next symbol that I chose is the idea that there was no room at the inn where they tried to get shelter. The Holy Family tried to get shelter. So the no room at the inn symbolizes the state of consciousness of a closed mind. In the closed mind, there's no room for the spiritual awareness necessary to host the Christ consciousness. We must remain open to receiving Christ's loving guidance. So as you light this candle, say after me, I choose to keep an open mind so that I may live in as a spiritual being. I am loved and guided by the Christ consciousness. And next we have the symbol of the birth in a manger. As we know, they could find no room at the inn. And so they found a manger where animals slept and got a little bit of warmth for the night. And so being born in a manger is a symbol of humility. We cannot experience the Christ consciousness when we're all puffed up with false pride or ego. We must truly know that all power is of God. So as we light the fourth candle, I invite you to say, I humbly recognize that my spiritual self is where I find true power and joy as I invite the Christ consciousness. the fifth symbol is the star. The star that was shown in the east represents spiritual guidance. The east metaphysically represents the subconscious or superconscious part of our minds. So as we remain open to the guidance from spirit, we invite the Christ consciousness. As you light that, please say after me, I remain open to spiritual guidance as I welcome the Christ consciousness within me. And the next symbol is the wise men visit from the east. The wise men represent the true wealth of life lived from a spiritual perspective. The wise men were guided by a star in the east in order to find the Christ child. And again, the east represents metaphysically the superconsciousness part of our minds. So we experience a wealth of wisdom and abundance in our lives when we are guided by the Christ consciousness. So say with me, I am guided from within to find and live by the Christ consciousness. And lastly, the last symbol are the angels that appeared to the shepherds and told them that the Christ child was born. So angels represent grace from spirit. And as we cultivate a spiritual life, we receive times of grace and inspiration. The experience of grace of God's love allows us to know the Christ consciousness. So as we light the seventh and last candle, please say after me, I choose to experience the grace of God as I cultivate and know the Christ consciousness within me. And so it is. So ends the candlelighting service. And so we now would like to, for 15 minutes or so, have a discussion about these symbols and how you may use them and what the Christ consciousness means for you. And so do you want to leave the candles on?
Sure.
Yeah, they're pretty. So, you know, it can seem very puffed up and egocentric to talk about Christ within us. But that is in fact what the New Testament talks about. It says, be ye of the same mind that is in Christ Jesus. So be of the same mind as Christ Jesus. So how do we do that? Well, when we realize that that spark of the divine is within us, then we know how he taught us to behave, which is to love one another and help one another, and not go by the current laws necessarily, as for example, when he rescued the woman who was being stoned for infidelity, for adultery, which is defined as a married Jewish woman who was unfaithful to her husband. And instead he stopped that. And even though that was the law to stone such a person, he stopped that and said, you who is without sin, cast the first one and cast it. You said it before.
Cast the first stone.
He
He was without sin, cast the first stone.
Yes, he who is without sin, cast the first stone. And of course they stopped because all of them were not without sin.
Yeah, really.
And so, and you know, the recent Christian, I think it was recent, it could have been 20 years ago, but they had a campaign and I saw a lot of people wearing little plastic bracelets that said WWJD.
What would Jesus do?
Yeah, WWJD was all over everything. And the concept was, when you don't know what to do or say, ask yourself, what would Jesus do? And I think that's how we practice the Christ consciousness, is to ask ourselves, what would he do?
Mhm.
And would it be loving? Would it be forgiving? Would it be understanding?
Well, I think it's so important for us, if we can, to embrace the idea that Jesus was the great example, not the great exception. When we start to look into that, the great example, and we allow ourselves to be an example, we allow ourselves to be a channel for his good, for the greater good. And I think until we allow ourselves to be in that place, how could the good that we're requesting or desiring flow through us? Because we've already said, well, it's not for me. So we have to say that which is Christ is in me, which opens the door to the good, to the healing, and to all that's possible.
Right.
Recently, I mean, every night when I go to bed, because I do my own prayer work, and one of my prayers is that I would be a channel for blessings for the people that I work with. That what would happen for them is that being in the presence of the consciousness of good would allow them to experience healing. So what I'm saying is Jesus in me, the Christ consciousness in me, is open at the table where I work for the people sitting around me. So I go to work and I'm sitting there doing my work, having a conversation, and two of the clients said, "Do you realize that just sitting here just changes everything?" I said, "What do you mean?" It's like I'm not in a treatment program. It's like, this is so powerful. I didn't say anything. I said, "Well, that's really great to hear." And then they wrote to the supervisor and said to the supervisor, "I would have come here just for that opportunity to be at that table, to spend time coloring pictures with Bob." It's not coloring pictures with Bob. It's allowing and inviting the Christ consciousness to flow through me. Did I do something spectacular or grand or wonderful? I just became a channel for whatever was possible. What we're asked to do is become a channel for good and not have to define it or figure it all out or say, well, thee and thou. And when I was younger and I would pray, I would say, "Dear Father, help thou, help thee." How can I get this right? Because
These
I
and
know,
thous.
yeah, because I know how they talk, And I would do the thee and the thou and all of that. And then I realized it's like, oh, that was ridiculous. And if God had a sense of humor, which I suspect is true, it would be laughter in the clouds, because it would be, we don't need to be pretend that we're not connected. We don't need to pretend we are connected. We just are.
And those these and thous were just how the English language was spoken when it was first written, which was a very long time ago. And Jesus spoke Aramaic. He did not speak English.
He never used
So
one
it
thee or thou.
doesn't even matter.
Right.
Doesn't matter what language you use. You
No.
certainly don't need to use the archaic English
No.
to pray
Well, I
to
was
God.
a Lutheran, and that was a rather archaic religion.
Well, yeah, I mean, they would use certainly the King James Version.
I want to talk a little bit about the virgin birth, and I think the virgin birth, but you mentioned as purity.
Yes.
Every day to be a virgin to the possibility of good, and not to be used up, exhausted, worn out, beat up in what has happened to us, but to be born again, to be new again in our pursuit of spirituality. With my clients, I say, it's time to push the reset. And I think, what we need to do as spiritual people is whenever we're not, whenever that virgin identity, that it could happen, all things are possible. Whenever that phase, which push the reset and say, this is possible. Good is possible.
And I just have to say this.
Yes.
The idea of that it was a virgin birth, it really came from mistranslation.
Yeah.
Because the word that was actually first used in Greek just meant young maiden. And because the first Bible was written in Greek, that was the official language that everyone did, that then changed to Latin. And so in that translation from Greek to Latin, it was translated this version, and the two different words, and I don't remember which was which, but probably the Greek was betula, and the Latin is alma, and it just means maiden, a young maiden. So, but in the translation, it was changed to virgin. I don't know if that was at what point, because then it became from Latin to English.
And I'm not sure that wasn't political.
Well, I don't
Yeah.
think so. I think it was just mistranslation.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, she certainly as a maiden, she was you know, that was certainly pure, and that's all that matters, really. But I love that you're elaborating on some of these concepts. So
And I-
please
And I
continue.
love angels. Angels represent grace from spirit. I think we need to allow grace in our own life. We need to be able to allow that whatever we've done, there's something greater than that we have done that is possible that can come through us. And that's the grace. I think, have any of you ever made any mistakes? And have you spent a lot of time beating yourself up for the mistakes that you've made? Or do you believe it's possible that there's a thing called grace that is allowing you to continue to push that reset and say, I can in fact go on. I can in fact live this life and have it be a good life. I've read somewhere not long ago that behind every wise person, there are many more mistakes than there was wisdom. And we learn from our mistakes, or we beat ourselves up for them. So grace is really an interesting concept. The grace of God allows us to know the Christ consciousness, that you can't use what's happened to you or your lack of consciousness as a reason not to become conscious. And that's important.
You know, Jesus really was a teacher, and he was teaching us to be like him. And so
Yeah.
instead, what we've done is we put him up on a pedestal as the only Son of God, and we don't expect ourselves to be as kind, as loving, as forgiving, as understanding as he was. And that's what he wants of us. He wants us to act like him.
The star is interesting to me because the star is something that brings light to us, but it's also far, far away.
Mm.
It's a light, it gets our attention, and yet it can easily be dismissed and it can easily be missed.
Mhm.
And so the light, the metaphysical wisdom that we're given, it's like a light in the sky, and think, did I see that? Is that true? And you have to look again, and you have to trust. And if you look in the sky, you'll see many, many stars, and there are some that will teach you one thing and some that will teach you something different, but they're all elusive. And so this thing from the East, I also think when it talks about the East versus the West, it's talking about left brain versus right brain.
Mhm.
We're talking about that intuitive part of us that we need to trust more, and that all that is to be known about the world is not logical. These are just the fascinating ones. The birth in the manger, I think, is also interesting because what the birth in the manger to me represents, there's no way this can happen. There's no way this is going to happen. This isn't a possibility. And I can't imagine Mary saying, oh, this will be fine. So I can't imagine that this is going to be a good thing for her. I imagine she was saying, you didn't call ahead and make reservations. I mean, what was wrong? I told you to do that, you know.
No phones. in
Yeah, I
those
can see
days.
them not getting along. There was no bed and breakfast. So, but the impossibility of the birth of consciousness, we have to be willing to recognize that we are
There's no
often,
place for it.
that our greatest breakthroughs happen in the most impossible circumstances, in the
Yeah.
most impossible situations. And so when we're faced with adversity, when we're faced with difficulty, it's a really good idea for us to say to ourselves, yes, an opportunity, as opposed to, oh my God, why is this happening to me? Because most of the things that have happened to you that you've learned from, you didn't think you would learn anything when they were happening.
Well, and it's interesting that in Chinese, the word for crisis is the same word as opportunity.
Mhm.
So it really is. A
Yeah.
crisis is an opportunity for change.
And in Bethlehem, which is the house of bread, which I think that's really fascinating, who is not fed by their spiritual good? Who is not fed by what we learn from this business of opening up to the Christ consciousness? It's food, it's nourishment. And the people that I know that are the hungriest, that are starving, that need the bread of Christ, they're starving because they've said, no, I can't accept that. I can't accept this. I can't believe in anything I can't see, put my hand on. And so this really is, it's invisible nourishment that without, it's questionable whether you can even survive in many cases. Many people don't. These are just fascinating. And I think I also want to say thank you, Judith, for having taken the time to do this. This is a real gift. You know,
Thank you.
not everybody that would think to do that. The wise man from the East represents true wealth of life lived from the spiritual perspective. again, it's east versus west, and it's consciousness versus the lack of consciousness. It's, I think, the tangible physical world versus the spiritual world. And the gifts that the wise men brought were symbolic gifts. They weren't gifts that could be spent. They didn't give them charge cards.
Well, and these supposedly were very wealthy kings, princes from.
Yeah.
And they came to humbly pay homage to
Yes.
the birth of this Christ child. So more important than wealth and money was the honoring of the.
Well, it's a symbolic meaning of it, because the gifts themselves represented the value they were placing on this birth, not the items that they were actually giving. And so you can give gold, but what is gold?
Gold, frankincense, and
Yeah.
myrrh.
Yeah. And, but I think it's fascinating, but also wise men had to travel some distance. This journey to consciousness, well, this process of consciousness is a journey. And so I think the wise men also represent the willingness to pick up and go a distance and bring our gifts and bring our good with us, to be willing to share.
And those three things were very valuable in that day. Gold has always been valuable. Frankincense was not only used for the fragrance of it, but it was also used as a healing ointment. And myrrh, I think, was just the fragrance of it, because that was very valuable in a country without a lot of water for washing and whatnot. That was, the fragrance was nice to have in tents or homes. So thank you for elaborating on those. And I think that we are approaching the end of this candlelighting service.
Yes.
So we hope it brings you spiritual nourishment to understand that the Christ is within us, because God is within us. But we grow it as we pay attention to it, as we honor it, as we acknowledge it, as we act as Jesus would act. And so we really do call this a holy day, a holiday, and we honor the Christ consciousness within each one of us.
Each one of you.
Each one of you.
Each one of you is a light. And we've said this many times, that the talks that we do and the gifts that we give, that we have to give, would not be given if it were not for you. And so, and if they weren't given because you weren't there, would we have the thoughts we have that enrich us?
Mm.
Would we have the consciousness we have? So we're all in this together in a way that is really, really quite wonderful. And I want to say thank you to all of you, wish all of you the most amazing new year. And my prayer for you is that the celebration of life and of the Christ consciousness will be a continuous celebration for you every day for the rest of this next year.
Indeed, and so be it.
And this is where we're going to end the recording.
I did the square box.